long before stone pyramids cast their silent, towering shadows across the endless, wind-swept sands of Egypt, before pristine marble columns rose proudly in the sun-drenched hills of Greece, and before Roman roads stitched together a massive, unyielding empire, a quieter but equally momentous story had already begun on the shifting surface of our earth. It unfolded in a landscape of unimaginable material wealth and terrifying geopolitical power, a world of shimmering, distant horizons where a legendary island empire carved its majestic way across the dark waves of the open sea. This territory was Atlantis, a name that carries the very weight of our collective human doubts, an empire that dared to believe itself completely invincible before the violent fury of the natural elements claimed its ultimate destiny. Good evening, and welcome back to History Before Sleep channel. Tonight, we are beginning a long, deeply immersive journey across the cold waters of time, entering a world of immense ambition, silent steel of human willpower, and the ultimate fragility of human hope. Our task is to walk carefully, hour by hour, through the entire epic story of Atlantis, letting the slow, steady rhythm of the narrative carry us down into the memory of this world of mud, oceans, and stars. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening right now, let me know your location and the local time in the comments. I love knowing we're all gathered here together across the hours and the miles. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. What does it feel like to be absolutely certain that everything will go according to plan? To be so certain that you never pause to imagine another ending at all? And what happens when the safest and oldest structures of human life begin to transform so quietly that almost no one believes the reality of the grand changes until the old ways are gone forever? In the early, fragile spring of human civilization, a profound sense of absolute certainty began to shift, moving away from the wild, unpredictable, open forests and toward the regulated, heavy structures of the early Mediterranean states. The story of Atlantis begins not in the dark depths of the ocean or through the sudden discovery of modern underwater archaeology, but within the cool, quiet philosophical schools of ancient Athens around the year 360 before Christ. Within the elegant marble colonnades of the famous academy, the legendary philosopher Plato crafted two complex, interconnected dialogues that would spark centuries of endless speculation, intense academic debate, and relentless exploration across the globe. These highly celebrated works, the Timaeus and the Critias, represent the absolute, sole ancient source for what would become one of history's most enduring, mysterious, and captivating legends. To fully understand the profound intellectual environment in which this narrative was born, we must step back into the deep political past of the Greek city-states, moving through the historical traumas that shaped Plato's philosophical worldview. Athens had recently emerged from the crushing devastation of the Peloponnesian War, a catastrophic conflict born from its own aggressive imperial overreach, unchecked democracy, and moral decline. The city that had once stood as the proud defender of Greek freedom against the massive Persian invasions had transformed into a cynical, greedy empire, leading to its ultimate defeat and the tragic execution of Plato's beloved teacher, Socrates. It was within this climate of profound disillusionment and structural crisis that Plato sought to construct his theoretical models of the ideal state, using the vast canvas of historical mythology to illustrate the eternal laws of cosmic justice and human responsibility. The story of Atlantis was never designed to be a simple piece of exotic travel literature or a basic record of maritime exploration. It was a carefully constructed philosophical mirror, held up to the citizens of contemporary Athens to warn them of the inevitable destruction that awaits any society that separates its material prosperity from divine virtue. Plato's account emerges through the complex voice of Critias, a wealthy Athenian aristocrat and political figure based heavily on his own great-grandfather, who claims to have inherited the strange tale through an unbroken chain of oral tradition stretching back to the legendary Athenian lawgiver, Solon. According to this multi-layered narrative framework, Solon, recognized as one of the 7 sages of the ancient Greek world, had traveled extensively to Egypt around the year 590 before Christ to study their ancient systems of governance, law, and religious observation. Upon his arrival in the ancient, delta-bound city of Sais, Solon encountered elite Egyptian priests who held the keys to temple archives that supposedly contained written records spanning millennia. The priests looked upon the Greek visitor with a sense of gentle, elder condescension, famously declaring that the Greeks were permanent children, possessing no ancient wisdom or grey-haired traditions due to the cyclical catastrophes of fire and water that routinely wiped out Mediterranean civilizations. It was during these intimate, late-night discussions within the sacred temple precincts that the Egyptian keepers of memory revealed to Solon the secret history of an immense maritime power that had existed 9,000 years before their time, a powerful island nation that had once threatened to enslave the entire known world before vanishing beneath the waves in a single, cataclysmic day and night. The Timaeus dialogue serves primarily as an introduction to this epic narrative, positioning the story of Atlantis as a historical prelude to Plato's grander discussion regarding the structural nature of the cosmos, the creation of the human soul, and the ideal organization of human society. Within this philosophical framework, Critias briefly outlines the basic premise of the conflict. Ancient Athens, existing in a forgotten golden age of absolute military virtue and perfect social harmony, had stood as the sole champion of human freedom, successfully defending the entire Mediterranean basin against the aggressive, unstoppable expansion of the Atlantean Empire. This preliminary account establishes the fundamental dualism that defines Plato's political philosophy, setting the virtuous, balanced, and agrarian Athenian state in direct opposition to the corrupt, ostentatious, and hyper-commercialized maritime empire of the West. The story is presented not as a fiction, but as a literal, absolute truth, preserved by the oldest civilizations on Earth, an unyielding historical warning meant to illustrate how even the most spectacular material achievements of humanity can be erased from the face of the planet when they violate the supreme laws of the cosmic order. The profound philosophical framework established by Plato within his dialogues does not merely introduce a lost continent, it meticulously constructs a balanced cosmic and political chessboard. To the classical Greek mind, an empire could not exist in a vacuum, nor could its catastrophic downfall be truly understood without a perfectly matched counterweight. In Plato's structural design, that counterweight was an idealized, the primordial version of Athens itself, a society completely operating on the cardinal virtues of wisdom, courage, temperance, and justice. This ancient, forgotten Athens was positioned as the ultimate historical defense mechanism of the Mediterranean world, the only force capable of standing firmly against the aggressive, tidal expansion of the Atlantean Empire. The transmission of this ancient memory from the temple archives of Egypt to the philosophical circles of Athens represents a complex journey through different concepts of time, documentation, and historical awareness. When the legendary Athenian lawgiver Solon arrived in Sais around the year 590 before Christ, he sought to impress the native priesthood by recounting the oldest genealogical legends of his people, attempting to construct a historical timeline based on the shallow generations of Greek lineage. It was at this precise moment that a grey-haired Egyptian priest, surrounded by stone walls covered in thousands of deeply carved hieroglyphic signs, famously interrupted the Greek visitor to deliver a profound, condescending truth regarding the structural amnesia of the Mediterranean world. The priest explained that while the societies of Greece and Asia were repeatedly plunged back into a state of illiterate infancy by cyclical global catastrophes of fire and water, the unique geography of Egypt, protected and nourished by the gentle, predictable flooding of the Nile, allowed their scribes to permanently document and preserve the collective memory of the human race across thousands of uninterrupted years. According to these beautifully preserved papyrus rolls, the greatest collective achievement ever recorded within the sacred halls of Sais was the forgotten defense of the Mediterranean basin by the primal ancestors of Athens against the unstoppable, tidal expansion of the Atlantean Empire. The Egyptian priests revealed to Solon that 9,000 years before their era, a magnificent naval power had erupted from the vast unknown spaces of the Western Ocean, marching eastward with a single, aggressive geopolitical ambition: to conquer, enslave, and integrate Egypt, Greece, and everything existing within the boundaries of the Pillars of Hercules into their vast, centralized system of absolute tyranny. This dynamic invasion was not merely a random act of territorial friction or a local border dispute over trading routes. It was an existential, apocalyptic collision between two entirely different structures of human life, a confrontation between a society that derived its power from internal spiritual virtue and an empire that measured its greatness solely through the accumulation of material wealth, technology, and global dominion. In the initial centuries of their immense history, before the weight of their own material success began to distort their inner moral fabric, the early inhabitants of Atlantis lived in perfect harmony with the divine principles established by their patron deity, Poseidon. Because their royal lineage was anchored directly to the bloodline of the gods, they possessed an acute sensitivity to the transient, fragile nature of material wealth, treating their vast reserves of gold, silver, and precious metals with an absolute philosophical detachment. They understood that the physical infrastructure of their empire, their soaring palaces, their crowded harbors, and their mathematical rings of land and water were merely temporary instruments that had to be managed with an unyielding standard of justice, temperance, and fraternal wisdom. Their society functioned with a beautiful, harmonious efficiency that closely mirrored the ideal republic that Plato envisioned in his academic lectures, where each social class and each governing institution fulfilled its proper and natural role, according to the immutable laws of the cosmic order. But as the long generations advanced across the centuries, the divine element within the Atlantean nature became increasingly diluted through continuous intermarriage with mortals, causing their unique character to systematically and irreversibly deteriorate. The unblemished virtue that had protected their golden age from the corrupting influence of power was quietly replaced by an insatiable human hunger for luxury, political ambition, and imperial expansion. They looked upon their towering metallic walls, their elaborate networks of deep canals, and their highly disciplined military forces no longer as gifts from the gods to be managed with a noble humility, but as weapons of absolute dominion to be turned against the weaker nations of the earth. They had become entirely blind to the true, spiritual foundations of their wealth, celebrating the visible, glittering veneer of civilizational progress, while their internal moral structures were turning completely into dust, setting the stage for a dramatic, cosmic lesson that would resonate across the millennia. Inside the grand public spaces and crowded assembly halls of contemporary Athens, the specific details of this moral decline carried an immediate, terrifying relevance for Plato's audience. The citizens who gathered within the shadow of the Parthenon were acutely aware that their own recently collapsed empire had followed an identical structural trajectory, moving from the noble defenders of Greek freedom against Persian tyranny to an aggressive, arrogant naval power whose unchecked greed had ultimately led to catastrophic defeat in the Peloponnesian War. Plato was not merely writing an ancient history or recording an exotic legend from the Nile. He was utilizing the spectacular, myth-shrouded rise and fall of Atlantis as a profound pedagogical tool to warn his contemporaries that material wealth and military power, when divorced from wisdom and virtue, will inevitably attract their own absolute destruction. The lost continent stood as a magnificent warning monument, etched into the philosophical imagination of the West, a timeless reminder that the ultimate vulnerability of any civilization lies not in the external threats at its gates, but in the internal decay of its moral character. The geographic location beyond the Pillars of Hercules similarly served multiple narrative purposes. This placement removes Atlantis from the familiar Mediterranean world, while positioning it as a genuine threat to the civilizations Plato's audience knew. The Atlantic Ocean represented the edge of the known world, a realm of mystery where extraordinary civilizations might plausibly have existed. The subsequent impossibility of these waters, due to mud shoals, provides a convenient explanation for why no contemporary explorers had rediscovered the lost continent. The question of Plato's intent in creating the Atlantis narrative has generated scholarly debate for centuries. Several factors suggest that Plato conceived Atlantis primarily as a philosophical allegory rather than historical fact. The account appears exclusively in Plato's works, with no corroborating evidence from other ancient sources who would have had access to the same Egyptian records. The detailed numerical specifications, from military forces to architectural dimensions, display the systematic precision characteristic of Plato's theoretical constructions, rather than the approximate estimates typical of historical accounts. Furthermore, the Atlantis story serves specific philosophical and political purposes within the broader context of Plato's work. The contrast between virtuous ancient Athens and corrupt Atlantis mirrors the distinction between the ideal state described in the Republic and the degenerate democracies Plato criticized in contemporary Greece. The cyclical rise and fall of civilizations reflected Plato's theories about political change and the inevitable corruption of even the best-ordered states over time. The pedagogical function of the Atlantis narrative also supports its allegorical interpretation. Plato frequently employed myths and stories to illustrate abstract philosophical concepts, making complex ideas accessible through concrete imagery. The tale of Atlantis provides a vivid example of how material, prosperity, and military power, divorced from virtue and wisdom, inevitably lead to moral corruption and ultimate destruction. This lesson carried particular relevance for Plato's contemporaries, who had witnessed Athens' transformation from the defender of Greek freedom against Persian invasion to an aggressive imperial power whose overreach had led to defeat in the Peloponnesian War. The specific details of Atlantean society often mirror and critique aspects of Athenian civilization during its imperial period. The extensive naval forces, the tribute-paying subject territories, the magnificent public buildings funded by imperial wealth, and the gradual erosion of traditional values all reflected patterns that Plato's audience would have recognized from their own recent history. The catastrophic end of Atlantis served as a warning about the potential consequences of imperial hubris and moral decline. Yet the possibility remains that Plato drew inspiration from actual historical events or civilizations, even while crafting a primarily allegorical narrative. The Bronze Age collapse around 1200 before Christ had witnessed the sudden disappearance of several advanced civilizations, including the Mycenaean Greeks and the Hittite Empire. Memories of these catastrophes might have survived in oral traditions, providing a historical foundation for Plato's fictional elaboration. The detailed architectural blueprints laid out in the Critias dialogue introduce a metropolis of extraordinary sophistication, a city planned not by the random, scattered growth of common migration, but by the direct, mathematical precision of divine engineering. In Plato's account, the layout of the Atlantean capital served as a physical manifestation of its internal structural complexity, presenting a physical landscape composed of alternating, concentric rings of land and water. The central island, where the primal seeds of the royal bloodline were first planted, measured approximately 50 stadia in diameter, a distance translating roughly to 5.7 miles across. This layout was systematically linked to the open ocean by a series of grand civil engineering projects, including massive subterranean tunnels excavated beneath the rings of land, allowing high-prowed ships to glide effortlessly from the outer sea into the most protected interior waterways of the empire. Surrounding this concentric matrix of land masses rose a series of defensive and ceremonial walls that reflected both strict military pragmatism and an ostentatious display of absolute material wealth. Each ring was securely wrapped in its own continuous fortification, and the surfaces of these walls were coated in distinct metallic layers that caught the sun like living flame. Scribes recorded that the outermost wall was covered in shimmering brass, the middle wall was coated in bright tin, and the innermost wall encircling the secure heart of the city gleamed with the mysterious, deep red reflections of orichalcum, a rare metal mined directly from the earth that Plato describes as second in practical and economic value only to gold itself. These dazzling metallic boundaries would have created an unparalleled spectacle for sailors approaching from the open Atlantic, reflecting the relentless sun across the expanse of the harbour and remaining visible from immense distances out at sea. At the absolute centre of this metallic grid, standing upon the raised ground of the interior citadel, rose the magnificent temple of Poseidon, the primordial patron deity and architect of the island's destiny. This monumental religious structure, measuring 600 feet in total length, 300 feet in width, and rising proportionally tall toward the heavens, was constructed entirely from solid silver, save for its golden pinnacles that scraped the open sky. Inside the incense-filled, candlelit inner sanctum, a colossal gold statue of Poseidon, driving a chariot pulled by 6 winged horses, dominated the entire interior space, reaching so high that its crown nearly touched the decorated ceiling of the sanctuary. Surrounding this massive divine image stood the golden statues of the 10 original Atlantean kings and their wives, a glittering, dynastic pantheon frozen in precious metal that stood as a permanent reminder of the shared divine lineage that linked the earthly rulers to the cosmic powers of the ocean. The social organization that governed this spectacular physical infrastructure operated under a unique, highly integrated system that combined elements of hereditary monarchy, elite aristocracy, and a centralized federalist alliance. The 10 kings, each representing one of the distinct lineages, descended from Atlas, the firstborn son of Poseidon, held absolute sovereign authority over their own specific regions of the island and its vast external subject territories. Yet, to preserve the structural unity of the empire and prevent the arrival of internal, destructive civil wars, these 10 rulers gathered every 5th and 6th year, alternately within the sacred chambers of the Temple of Poseidon. This cyclical meeting allowed the kings to deliberate on matters of common economic interest, coordinate their foreign diplomacy, and pass judgment on any infractions of their sacred laws, which had been etched permanently by their ancestors into a massive pillar of orichalcum standing at the heart of the temple. The economic foundation that sustained this complex governmental machinery and funded the elaborate construction projects of the capital rested on the island's extraordinary, unblemished, natural abundance. The vast rectangular plains of Atlantis were remarkably fertile, producing 2 separate golden harvests every single year by utilizing a dual system of winter rains and extensive summer irrigation directed through a network of canals. The main canal was an engineering marvel of the ancient world, measuring 300 feet wide, 100 feet deep, and stretching for an unthinkable 1,125 miles to connect the interior capital directly to the open sea. This immense aquatic artery was supported by thousands of smaller, secondary channels that cut through the farming plains in a beautiful grid pattern, facilitating both the distribution of life-giving water to the crops and the rapid, cost-effective transportation of raw timber, stone, and agricultural yields from the countryside to the crowded urban marketplaces. This agricultural productivity allowed the empire to develop extensive, far-flung trade networks that brought exotic luxury goods and vital raw materials from the most distant corners of the known world into the ports of the capital. The outermost water ring, functioning as a massive, hyper-commercialized harbor facility, was continuously packed with merchant vessels, foreign traders, and fleets of warships arriving from the Mediterranean, Africa, and northern Europe. The Atlanteans had successfully transformed their isolated geography into the ultimate economic pivot of the Western Hemisphere, mastering advanced metallurgic techniques to refine not only conventional copper and tin, but also to extract the mysterious orichalcum directly from their rich mountain veins. They had built a world where nature and human ingenuity were perfectly synchronized, creating a material paradise that seemed destined to endure across the centuries, entirely safe from the decay that naturally stalks the common achievements of mortal men. As the deep stillness of the night settles completely over the landscape, let your thoughts release the active calculations of the waking world. The metallic walls, the glittering gold statues of the temple, and the silent, deep canals of the ancient capital fade softly into the background of your consciousness, leaving only the peaceful, regular breathing of the present moment. The dynamic forces of history and the grand designs of ancient kings rest quietly beneath the starlit sky, suspended in a timeless harmony that spans across the vast ocean of time. Let the profound, comforting stability of this ancient order wrap around you like a protective shield, allowing the slow, steady rhythm of time to carry your mind away into a deep, peaceful, and undisturbed sleep. The staggering economic wealth and natural abundance generated by the rectangular plains of Atlantis fueled the development of a military machine whose sheer scale permanently redefines our understanding of ancient warfare. Plato provides meticulous, highly specific numbers regarding the defensive mobilization of the island, describing a society where every district was systematically bound to contribute a fixed quota of men, weapons, and vehicles to the central command of the royal palace. Scribes recorded that the fertile countryside was divided into 60,000 distinct military allotments, each managed by a designated leader who was strictly responsible for fielding a precise segment of the imperial army. This highly organized conscription system allowed the 10 kings to assemble a combined terrestrial and maritime force that exceeded 1 million active combatants, supported by a civilian population numbering in the tens of millions. The breakdown of these military capabilities reveals both strict tactical sophistication and an immense concentration of strategic resources across the island's provinces. According to the ancient narrative, the island could field 60,000 leaders of soldiers, supported by 120,000 heavily armed hoplites trained to fight in dense, disciplined formations. This terrestrial force operated alongside an incredible long-range skirmishing corps, composed of 180,000 expert archers and an equal number of highly mobile slingers. To overwhelm the enemy lines before the infantry engagement, the kings could deploy 300,000 specialized javelin men and stone shooters, supported by a formidable cavalry elite, consisting of 2,000 horsemen and an astonishing 60,000 heavy war chariots. This massive terrestrial army was seamlessly integrated with an unparalleled naval apparatus that included 1,200 fully equipped warships, each carrying a standard crew of 200 highly trained marines, creating a global maritime superpower capable of projecting absolute power across the open Atlantic and deep into the Mediterranean basin. Yet, beneath this spectacular veneer of material prosperity, technological mastery, and unmatched military dominance, Plato weaves a haunting narrative of gradual moral decline that serves as the absolute philosophical core of his entire account. Initially, the citizens and rulers of Atlantis embodied pure virtue and wisdom, their divine heritage from Poseidon, manifesting in a just system of governance and a profound detachment from the seductive illusions of the material world. However, as the generations advanced across the centuries, and the divine element within their lineage became systematically diluted through continuous intermarriage with mortal human beings, their inner spiritual fabric began to irreversibly deteriorate. The unblemished integrity that had protected their golden age from the corrupting influence of wealth was quietly replaced by an insatiable human hunger for luxury, unchecked political ambition, and aggressive, arrogant, imperial expansion. This transformation from pristine virtue to absolute structural corruption represents the central allegorical warning of Plato's narrative, drawing a devastating parallel between the idealized past and the realities of mortal politics. The early Atlanteans, much like the ideal citizens Plato constructed in his famous lectures on the Republic, possessed the cardinal virtues of wisdom, courage, temperance, and justice, allowing their society to function with a beautiful, harmonious efficiency because each individual fulfilled their proper role according to their nature and abilities. The later Atlanteans, by contrast, exemplified the profound dangers of an unchecked, materialistic democracy and extreme excess patterns that Plato directly observed and fiercely criticized within contemporary Athens. The once noble descendants of the sea god had become entirely blind to the spiritual foundations of their true greatness, celebrating their towering walls and million-man fleets, while their internal moral structures had turned completely into dust, setting the stage for a dramatic, cosmic intervention that would echo across the millennia. As the grand design of this empire shows, the timeline Plato establishes for these monumental events places the Atlantis story approximately 9,600 years before his own era, somewhere around the year 9,500 before Christ. This dating positions the narrative in the immediate aftermath of the last major ice age, a turbulent planetary period when sea levels were indeed rising rapidly across the globe, and coastal civilizations might have faced catastrophic flooding. However, this vast 9,000-year gap also conveniently places the events far beyond the reach of any contemporary historical verification, lending the account an air of deep, ancient authenticity, while systematically preventing factual challenges from contemporary Greek chroniclers who sought to map the physical remnants of the past. The immense temporal and geographical distance established within the Platonic text serves as a sophisticated mechanism to shield the narrative from immediate historical verification, while simultaneously expanding its philosophical resonance. By anchoring the cataclysm to an era roughly 9,600 years before his own lifetime, Plato placed the rise and fall of Atlantis safely beyond the reach of any contemporary Greek archive. Yet, as modern science looks back at the year 9,500 before Christ, this chronological choice uncovers a striking convergence with the deep structural past of our planet. This era marks the immediate aftermath of the last major ice age, a period of violent planetary instability during which melting glaciers triggered rapid sea level rises, coastal transformations, and catastrophic regional flooding that could easily have breathed life into the enduring global memory of a lost maritime world. The pedagogical function of this prehistoric timeline operates at the very center of Plato's philosophical intent. The meticulous, systematic precision with which the text details everything from the specific dimensions of the concentric channels to the exact numbers of the land and naval forces mirrors the theoretical constructions found in his works on the ideal, political state, rather than the rough, estimated approximations typical of ancient Greek historical writing. Plato frequently employed heavily structured myths and allegories as powerful pedagogical tools to make highly complex, abstract philosophical truths immediately accessible through concrete, vivid imagery. The dramatic contrast between ancient, virtuous Athens and the corrupt, imperialistic Atlantean Empire served as a vivid illustration of the concepts he developed in his famous dialogues on the Republic, acting as a direct critique of the political decay, material excess, and moral compromise that he witnessed within contemporary Greek democracies. This lesson carried a devastatingly sharp relevance for Plato's contemporaries, who had personally lived through the severe geopolitical traumas of their generation. The Athenian audience who listened to these dialogues had witnessed their own city-state undergo a profound, tragic transformation, moving from the noble defender of Greek liberty during the Persian invasions into an aggressive, arrogant naval empire whose unchecked hubris, heavy taxation of subject territories, and moral decay had ultimately invited its own crushing defeat in the Peloponnesian War. The specific attributes Plato assigned to the later generations of Atlantis, their extensive, dominant naval forces, their ostentatious public buildings funded by imperial expansion, and their systematic erosion of traditional spiritual values, were direct reflections of patterns his audience recognized from their own recent history. The catastrophic end of the lost continent was crafted not as an entertaining tale of maritime misfortune, but as an unyielding, prophetic warning to Athens and every subsequent civilization that dares to believe its own material progress has rendered it completely invincible to the eternal laws of cosmic justice. Yet, while the primary architecture of the narrative remains deeply rooted in philosophical allegory, the compelling possibility persists that Plato drew his initial creative inspiration from genuine historical catastrophes that had left an indelible mark on the collective consciousness of the ancient Mediterranean world. The twilight of the Bronze Age, occurring around the year 1200 before Christ, had witnessed the sudden, violent, and simultaneous collapse of several highly advanced civilizations across the Aegean and the Near East, including the sophisticated Mycenaean Greek kingdoms and the massive Hittite Empire. The sudden destruction of these flourishing palaces, the burning of coastal commercial hubs, and the rapid fragmentation of long-established trade networks plunged the region into centuries of illiterate darkness, leaving behind fragmented memories of a vanished era of golden greatness that survived exclusively through the fluid, shifting mechanisms of oral tradition. It was from these deep, ancestral echoes of real catastrophic ruin that Plato likely gathered the raw, material elements to forge his immortal myth, turning the broken fragments of human history into a timeless monument of philosophical instruction. The immediate aftermath of Plato's death, in the year 347 before Christ, marked the beginning of a complex intellectual legacy regarding his Atlantis narrative. Within the halls of the Academy and the Lyceum, Plato's most distinguished students grappled with the philosophical and historical implications of their master's account. None proved more influential in shaping subsequent interpretations than Aristotle, whose categorical dismissal of Atlantis as historical fact would echo through centuries of scholarly discourse. Aristotle's position on Atlantis emerged from his broader critique of Plato's philosophical methodology. As the most systematic and empirically minded of Plato's students, Aristotle possessed an acute sensitivity to the distinction between philosophical allegory and historical narrative. His famous declaration that the man who dreamed it up made it vanish represented more than casual skepticism. It reflected a fundamental disagreement about the proper relationship between philosophical instruction and factual accuracy. This terse dismissal, preserved in later sources, became the earliest recorded instance of scholarly skepticism toward the Atlantis account. The philosophical context surrounding Aristotle's rejection reveals deeper tensions within the Academy itself. Where Plato employed myth and allegory as vehicles for abstract truths, Aristotle increasingly favored direct logical argument and empirical observation. The Atlantis narrative, with its precise numerical details and elaborate geographical descriptions, presented exactly the kind of fictional framework, disguised as historical fact, that Aristotle found methodologically problematic. His criticism targeted not merely the content of the story, but Plato's entire approach to philosophical pedagogy. Other immediate disciples of Plato adopted more nuanced positions. Crantor of Soli, who studied directly under Xenocrates in the early 3rd century before Christ, represented the first known attempt to defend the historical authenticity of the Atlantis account. His commentary on the Timaeus, fragments of which survive in later Neoplatonic sources, argued that Plato had indeed based his narrative on genuine Egyptian records. Crantor claimed to have verified the existence of these records during his own travels, though the specific nature of his evidence remains unclear from surviving fragments. The absence of Atlantis references in contemporary historical works presents one of the most compelling arguments for Aristotle's position. Herodotus, writing his histories in the mid-5th century before Christ, demonstrated exhaustive curiosity about distant lands and ancient civilizations. His accounts encompass regions from Scythia to Ethiopia, incorporating local traditions, religious practices, and historical memories spanning centuries. Yet nowhere in his comprehensive survey of the Mediterranean world and its periphery does Herodotus mention any tradition resembling the Atlantis story, despite his documented fascination with Egyptian wisdom and historical records. Similarly, Thucydides, whose history of the Peloponnesian War established new standards for historical accuracy and source criticism, makes no reference to any ancient Athenian victory over a Western maritime empire. Given Thucydides' meticulous attention to Athenian historical traditions and his pride in documenting the city's past achievements, this omission carries particular weight. His account of early Greek history, though brief, includes references to various ancient conflicts and migrations that would have provided natural contexts for mentioning the Atlantis War if such traditions had existed. The geographic writings of Strabo, composed during the early Roman Empire, provide perhaps the most systematic ancient critique of the Atlantis narrative. Writing around the time of Augustus, Strabo possessed access to extensive geographical literature from the Hellenistic period, including works by explorers who had ventured beyond the Pillars of Hercules into the Atlantic Ocean. His dismissal of Atlantis as Plato's invention carried the weight of comprehensive geographical knowledge unavailable to earlier critics. Strabo's analysis focused particularly on the practical impossibilities of Plato's geographical claims. The assertion that Atlantis had been larger than Libya and Asia combined struck him as fundamentally incompatible with what Hellenistic explorers had discovered about the Atlantic Ocean's extent and character. Furthermore, Strabo noted that Plato's claim about impossible mud shoals preventing later exploration contradicted the experiences of contemporary navigators who had successfully sailed Atlantic waters. His geographical expertise lent scientific credibility to philosophical skepticism about the account's historical accuracy. The Roman historical tradition similarly ignored the Atlantis narrative, despite extensive engagement with Greek philosophical and historical sources. Livy's monumental history incorporated numerous Greek historical traditions and legends, yet makes no reference to Atlantis, despite covering periods when such a story might have provided useful comparative material. Tacitus, renowned for his critical approach to sources and his interest in the relationship between geography and political power, likewise omits any mention of the lost civilization, despite his detailed discussions of distant lands and peoples. This pattern of omission becomes particularly significant when contrasted with the Roman treatment of other Platonic ideas. Roman intellectuals readily adopted and adapted Plato's political theories, educational philosophy, and metaphysical concepts. Yet, the Atlantis narrative failed to gain traction in Roman historical or geographical literature, suggesting that educated Romans recognized its fictional character even when they embraced other aspects of Platonic thought. The rise of Neoplatonism during late antiquity marked a dramatic shift in the reception of the Atlantis narrative, beginning with Plotinus in the 3rd century of the Christian era and reaching full development under Proclus in the 5th century. Neoplatonic philosophers approached Plato's works with a fundamentally different interpretive framework than their classical predecessors. Rather than viewing the dialogues primarily as basic philosophical arguments or literal historical accounts, they understood them as complex allegorical systems encoding profound metaphysical truths. Proclus, writing his extensive commentary on the Timaeus around the year 440 of the Christian era, devoted considerable attention to defending both the historical accuracy and allegorical significance of the Atlantis account. His approach reflected the deep-seated Neoplatonic conviction that Plato's writings operated simultaneously on multiple levels of meaning. According to Proclus, the surface narrative of Atlantis described actual historical events, while the deeper allegorical structure revealed truths about the cosmic order and the soul's relationship to material existence. The Neoplatonic defense of Atlantis's historicity rested partly on theological arguments about divine providence and partly on elaborate theories about the relationship between time and eternity. Proclus argued that the Egyptian priests mentioned by Plato possessed genuine access to ancient records because their religious traditions maintained unbroken continuity with primordial wisdom. This continuity, guaranteed by divine providence, ensured the preservation of historical truth across millennia, despite the general human tendency toward cultural decline and forgetfulness. More significantly, Proclus developed sophisticated allegorical interpretations that transformed the Atlantis narrative into a magnificent cosmic drama. In his reading, the conflict between Athens and Atlantis represented the eternal struggle between intellectual and material principles within both the cosmos and the individual human soul. Ancient Athens embodied the philosophical life, a society completely oriented toward eternal truths, pure virtue, and the perfect ordering of the higher mind. Atlantis, by contrast, symbolized the material world's seductive power, sensory illusion, and ultimate structural instability. The sudden, violent destruction of Atlantis beneath the muddy waves of the ocean was thus illustrated as the inevitable, universal fate of any human soul or physical civilization that prioritized material, prosperity, and technological dominion over spiritual wisdom and divine alignment. These sophisticated allegorical interpretations allowed Neoplatonic philosophers to fully embrace the grand narrative of Atlantis, without confronting the severe historical and geographical difficulties that had continuously troubled earlier empirical critics like Aristotle and Strabo. By locating the story's primary significance in its symbolic rather than literal content, they could simultaneously affirm its fundamental truth and acknowledge its apparent incompatibility with known historical facts. This interpretive strategy proved deeply influential among later medieval and Renaissance readers, who inherited these Neoplatonic approaches to Platonic texts and utilized them to unlock the mysterious legends of the past. The encounter between the Atlantis narrative and early Christian thought produced complex and varied responses that reflected broader tensions between classical learning and biblical authority. Early Christian writers faced the immense challenge of integrating Greek philosophical wisdom with revealed truth while maintaining the absolute primacy of scriptural chronology and the biblical historical framework. The Atlantis story presented particular, deep-seated difficulties because its ancient dating appeared to conflict directly with biblical accounts of human history and divine providence. Clement of Alexandria, writing around the year 200 of the Christian era, demonstrated the sophisticated approach that characterized Alexandrian Christian scholarship. Rather than rejecting the Atlantis narrative outright, Clement sought to harmoniously align it with Christian historical understanding through careful chronological analysis. He argued that the Egyptian dating systems underlying Plato's account suffered from systematic errors that made ancient events appear far more remote than they actually were. By adjusting these overextended chronologies to align with biblical timelines, Clement suggested that the Atlantis story might actually refer to real events occurring within the valid framework of sacred history. Augustine of Hippo adopted a more skeptical stance that reflected his broader concerns about the relationship between classical learning and the Christian faith. In his monumental work, The City of God, Augustine acknowledged the profound philosophical value of Platonic thought, while maintaining a critical distance from specific historical claims that lacked scriptural support. His treatment of Atlantis exemplified this balanced approach, recognizing the story's powerful allegorical potential while expressing severe doubt about its literal, historical accuracy. The chronological problems posed by the Atlantis narrative became increasingly acute as Christian scholars developed more systematic, rigid approaches to universal history. The traditional dating of Atlantis to approximately 9,600 years before Plato's era, or around the year 9,500, before Christ created obvious, irreconcilable conflicts with biblical chronologies that placed the creation of humanity only a few millennia before the Christian era. Some Christian writers attempted to resolve this structural difficulty by arguing that Plato had misunderstood the complex Egyptian chronological systems, while others suggested that the story referred directly to the vast antediluvian civilizations mentioned obliquely in the Book of Genesis. Eastern Christian writers, particularly those working within the sophisticated Byzantine tradition, often proved far more receptive to the Atlantis narrative than their Western counterparts. The Byzantine scholarly tradition maintained a much closer continuity with classical Greek learning and showed a greater willingness to integrate non-biblical historical traditions into comprehensive universal frameworks. Some Byzantine chronographers attempted to incorporate the Atlantis story into their grand universal histories by identifying it with various biblical or post-biblical events. The patristic treatment of Atlantis also reflected broader theological concerns about divine justice and the ultimate fate of earthly civilizations. Many Christian writers found in the cataclysmic destruction of Atlantis a powerful, vivid illustration of divine judgment against human pride, unchecked material expansion, and moral corruption. This specific theological interpretation allowed them to fully embrace the story's profound moral message while remaining completely agnostic about its literal historical accuracy. The narrative's heavy emphasis on the gradual moral decline of an initially virtuous people resonated strongly with Christian understandings of human nature, the fall of man, and the direct consequences of sin. As the deep stillness of the night settles completely over the landscape, Let your thoughts release the active calculations of the waking mind. The heavy debates of the early church fathers, the chronological puzzles of the Old World, and the silent rows of ancient theological manuscripts fade softly into the background of your consciousness, leaving only the peaceful, regular breathing of the present moment. The intense historical and spiritual questions of the past rest quietly beneath the starlit sky, suspended in a timeless harmony that spans across the vast ocean of time. Let the profound, comforting stability of this sacred memory wrap around you like a protective shield under the warm covers, allowing the slow, steady rhythm of time to carry your mind away into a deep, peaceful, and undisturbed sleep. The preservation and transmission of classical texts during the early medieval period significantly influenced the later reception of the Atlantis narrative. As European scholars gradually recovered access to complete versions of Plato's dialogues in later centuries, they encountered the story within its original philosophical context rather than through the filtered interpretations of earlier commentators. This direct engagement with Plato's text would eventually prove crucial for later medieval and Renaissance developments in Atlantis interpretation. However, before that recovery could occur, the narrative had to endure a long, dark period of profound textual isolation within Western Europe. The collapse of classical learning institutions across Western Europe during the 5th and 6th centuries created an intellectual vacuum that profoundly affected the transmission of Platonic texts as barbarian invasions disrupted trade, networks, and urban centers. The elaborate manuscript copying operations that had sustained classical literature for centuries began to disintegrate. Monastic scriptoria, while preserving essential Christian texts, operated with severely limited resources and necessarily selective copying priorities. In this environment of intellectual triage, the complete works of Plato, including the dialogues containing the Atlantis narrative, effectively vanished from Western European libraries. The practical challenges facing medieval scholars extended far beyond simple manuscript availability. The Timaeus and Critias dialogues required not only Greek linguistic competence, but also familiarity with complex philosophical concepts and classical geographical knowledge that had largely disappeared from European intellectual culture. Even when fragments of Platonic texts survived in monastic collections, they often existed as isolated passages, divorced from their original context, making comprehensive interpretation nearly impossible for the scholars of the era. The Carolingian Renaissance of the 8th and 9th centuries, despite its significant achievements in preserving and copying classical texts, failed to recover the complete Platonic corpus. Charlemagne's scholars, working primarily from Latin sources, had access to only limited portions of Plato's work through intermediary sources like Cicero's translations and Augustinian commentaries. The Timaeus existed in a partial Latin translation through Chalcidius's 4th century version, but this specific translation ended abruptly at the point where Plato begins his detailed description of Atlantis, leaving medieval readers entirely without access to the complete narrative. This textual gap created a peculiar situation where educated Europeans possessed theoretical knowledge about Plato's philosophical importance while remaining largely ignorant of his specific teachings. Medieval encyclopedias, like those of Isidore of Seville, acknowledged Plato's significance in their comprehensive surveys of classical learning, yet their discussions necessarily relied on second-hand summaries rather than direct textual engagement. The Atlantis narrative, requiring access to the complete Timaeus and Critias dialogues, remained effectively unknown to medieval scholarship. The few references to lost civilizations that appeared in medieval literature typically derived from biblical or patristic sources rather than classical Greek philosophy. Medieval chroniclers showed considerable interest in antediluvian history and the fate of pre-Christian civilizations, but their investigations drew primarily from Genesis, the Book of Enoch, and early Christian historical works. When medieval writers speculated about ancient catastrophes or vanished peoples, they framed their discussions strictly within biblical chronology and theological interpretation rather than Platonic philosophy. As the deep silence of midnight blankets the ancient, quiet landscapes of our world, let your thoughts release the active calculations of the waking mind. The cold scriptoriums of the early monasteries, The scratching of quills on parchment under candlelight, and the silent, heavy vault doors protecting forgotten knowledge fade softly into the background of your consciousness, leaving only the peaceful, regular breathing of the present moment. The lost texts and the quiet thoughts of medieval scribes rest peacefully beneath the starlit sky, suspended in a timeless harmony that spans across the vast ocean of time. Let the profound, comforting stability of this quiet night wrap around you like a protective shield under the warm covers, allowing the slow, steady rhythm of time to carry your mind away into a deep, peaceful, and undisturbed sleep. The scholastic movement of the 12th and 13th centuries, despite its remarkably sophisticated and revolutionary engagement with classical philosophical texts, continued to lack access to the complete Platonic corpus. Thomas Aquinas, whose monumental Summa Theologiae demonstrated an exhaustive, legendary familiarity with Aristotelian philosophy, made only passing, brief references to Platonic ideas and showed absolutely no knowledge of the Atlantis narrative. This complete omission becomes particularly significant given Aquinas's incredibly comprehensive, systematic approach to integrating classical philosophy with Christian theological doctrine. Had he possessed direct access to the complete Platonic texts, the extraordinary story of Atlantis would likely have received an intense, rigorous theological and moral analysis, similar to his detailed treatment of other classical materials. The extensive translation movement, centered in medieval Spain, which brought numerous vital Arabic philosophical texts into Latin, also failed to recover the missing Platonic dialogues. Islamic scholars and philosophers had preserved extensive Aristotelian materials and developed highly sophisticated commentaries on Greek philosophical works, but their magnificent libraries apparently lacked complete versions of the Timaeus and Critias dialogues. This widespread absence suggests that the catastrophic textual loss had occurred early enough in history to severely affect both the Western Christian and the Islamic manuscript traditions, pointing directly to massive disruptions in the immediate post-classical period rather than later medieval developments. Byzantine scholars, by contrast, maintained a vastly superior access to Greek philosophical texts throughout the entire medieval period. Yet, even their extensive libraries appear to have suffered significant, quiet losses in specific Platonic materials over the centuries. While the scriptoriums of Constantinople successfully preserved many classical works that had completely disappeared from Western Europe, detailed references to Atlantis remain notably absent from Byzantine historical and geographical literature. This consistent pattern suggests that the textual disruption and lack of engagement affected Greek-speaking regions as well as Latin Europe, indicating widespread, systemic damage to the active manuscript tradition during the early medieval transition. The absolute absence of Atlantis references in medieval literature becomes particularly striking when contrasted with the period's intense, well-documented fascination with geographical speculation and legendary lands. Medieval writers, travelers, and mapmakers displayed a relentless curiosity about distant, unknown regions, mythical islands, and lost civilizations. They produced elaborate, highly detailed accounts of imaginary places like the earthly paradise, the rich and powerful kingdom of Prester John, and various mysterious Atlantic islands reported by weary sailors, such as St. Brendan's Island or the Isle of Man. The intellectual appetite and narrative space clearly existed within medieval culture for an epic like the Atlantis story. Yet, because the specific Platonic account remained entirely unavailable to satisfy this burning curiosity, it could not spark the imagination of the medieval mind. The world would have to wait for the dramatic collapse of the Eastern Empire before these forgotten archives could finally migrate westward, setting the stage for a spectacular intellectual rebirth. As the deep stillness of the night settles completely over the landscape, let your thoughts release the active calculations of the waking world. The grand universities of the scholastic masters, the dusty libraries of ancient Constantinople, and the legendary, uncharted islands drawn on old parchment maps fade softly into the background of your consciousness, leaving only the peaceful, regular breathing of the present moment. The intense intellectual quests of the past and the long-lost records of vanished empires rest quietly beneath the starlit sky, suspended in a timeless harmony that spans across the vast ocean of time. Let the profound, comforting stability of this quiet night wrap around you like a protective shield under the warm covers, allowing the slow, steady rhythm of time to carry your mind away into a deep, peaceful, and undisturbed sleep. The dramatic transformation of European intellectual culture began with the gradual recovery of classical Greek texts through close contact with Byzantine scholars and the systematic, passionate exploration of forgotten monastic libraries. The tragic fall of Constantinople in the year 1453 heavily accelerated this cross-cultural process, forcing elite Greek scholars to flee westward into Italy, carrying with them precious manuscript collections that had miraculously survived in the Eastern libraries. Among these recovered, priceless texts were the complete versions of Plato's dialogues, including the Timaeus and the Critias, which contained the full, unabridged Atlantis narrative. Marsilio Ficino's monumental Latin translation of Plato's complete works, successfully completed in Florence around the year 1484, marked the definitive, historic moment in the Atlantis narrative's return to Western European consciousness. Ficino, working under the direct, generous financial patronage of Cosimo de' Medici, approached his massive translation project with both a rigorous scholarly precision and a profound philosophical enthusiasm that beautifully reflected the broader Renaissance engagement with classical antiquity. His meticulous translation made the core Platonic texts widely accessible to educated Europeans for the first time in nearly a millennium, creating the absolute foundation for renewed, serious scholarly engagement with the Atlantis story. Ficino's interpretive approach to the Atlantis narrative deeply reflected his commitment to Neoplatonic philosophy and his firm belief in the fundamental compatibility between Platonic wisdom and Christian truth. Rather than viewing the account as either a pure, deceptive fiction or a literal, mundane history, Ficino understood it as a complex allegorical framework that encoded profound truths about human nature, the cosmos, and divine providence. His detailed commentaries heavily emphasized the moral dimensions of the narrative, interpreting the spectacular rise and sudden fall of Atlantis as a timeless illustration of the eternal conflict between higher spiritual values and lower, corrupting material desires. The intellectual environment of the brilliant Medici court proved particularly receptive to the Atlantis narrative's central themes of lost wisdom, ancient greatness, and civilizational collapse. Renaissance humanists, who were acutely conscious of their own civilization's fragile relationship to classical antiquity, found in the Atlantis story a powerful, deeply moving metaphor for the recovery and loss of human cultural achievement. The striking parallel between their own exhausting efforts to recover classical learning and Plato's account of ancient wisdom, safely preserved in the stone temples of Egypt, resonated powerfully with humanist sensibilities. Giovanni Pico della Mirandola's engagement with the Atlantis narrative beautifully exemplified this Renaissance synthesis of classical philosophy, Christian theology, and esoteric wisdom traditions. His famous oration on the dignity of man reflected the exact same boundless confidence in human potential that characterized Plato's description of the early, uncorrupted Atlantean civilization. Simultaneously, his sharp warnings regarding the dangers of material excess directly echoed the moral decline that Plato attributed to the later Atlantean generations, helping to establish the Atlantis story as a central reference point for Renaissance discussions about human nature, ethics, and civilizational development. The printing revolution of the late 15th century dramatically expanded public access to Ficino's Platonic translations, ensuring that the Atlantis narrative successfully reached scholarly audiences throughout Europe with unprecedented speed. The famous 1491 Venetian edition of Ficino's translation, produced by the legendary publisher Aldus Manutius, exemplified the new technology's immense capacity to disseminate classical texts with remarkable accuracy. Within mere decades, educated Europeans from London to Prague possessed direct access to complete versions of the Timaeus and Critias, ending the millennium-long absence of the Atlantis story from European intellectual discourse and setting the stage for a dramatic collision with the age of discovery. As the deep stillness of the night settles completely over the landscape, let your thoughts release the active calculations of the waking world. The elegant libraries of Renaissance Florence, the steady, rhythmic press of the early printing wheels, and the soft candlelight reflecting off freshly translated Latin parchment fade softly into the background of your consciousness, leaving only the peaceful, regular breathing of the present moment. The intense intellectual quests of the past and the grand designs of ancient philosophers rest quietly beneath the starlit sky, suspended in a timeless harmony that spans across the vast ocean of time. Let the profound, comforting stability of this quiet night wrap around you like a protective shield under the warm covers, allowing the slow, steady rhythm of time to carry your mind away into a deep, peaceful, and undisturbed sleep. The spectacular rediscovery of the Atlantis narrative within European scholarly circles coincided almost perfectly with the dramatic expansion of geographical knowledge during the Age of Exploration, creating unprecedented opportunities for radical new interpretations of Plato's account. Christopher Columbus's historic voyages across the vast Atlantic Ocean, beginning in the year 1492, occurred within a mere decade of Marsilio Ficino's monumental translation project, establishing a remarkable chronological convergence between textual recovery and maritime exploration. This timing proved absolutely crucial for subsequent interpretations of the Atlantis narrative, as European scholars suddenly possessed both direct access to Plato's complete account and concrete, contemporary evidence of previously unknown, massive landmasses lying directly beyond the Atlantic basin. The sudden Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire provided particularly compelling, vivid material for intense Atlantis speculation across Europe. Hernán Cortés' detailed letters describing the sophisticated urban planning, elaborate water management systems, and unimaginable wealth of Tenochtitlan immediately reminded educated Europeans of Plato's description of the Atlantean capital. The Mexican city's unique location on an island completely connected to the mainland by massive causeways, its highly complex system of internal canals and bustling harbors, and its impressive architectural achievements all seem to echo specific, meticulous details from the Critias dialogue. Francisco López de Gomara's celebrated work, Hispania Victrix, published in the year 1552, made the first explicit, historic connections between these newly discovered American civilizations and Plato's Atlantis narrative. López de Gomara argued with great conviction that the advanced indigenous cultures encountered by Spanish conquistadors provided concrete, empirical evidence that sophisticated civilizations had indeed existed in the Atlantic region in the ancient past, lending immense credibility to Plato's account. His radical interpretation suggested that the Atlantis story preserved genuine, factual, historical memories of pre-Columbian American civilizations, which had been transmitted through Egyptian records and ultimately recorded by the Greek philosopher. The specific geographical location of the Americas relative to the Mediterranean world also seemed to support Platonic accuracy with remarkable precision. The strategic positioning of the New World, directly beyond the Strait of Gibraltar, corresponded precisely to Plato's geographic description of Atlantis as lying immediately beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Furthermore, the vast size of the American continent beautifully matched Plato's dramatic claim that Atlantis had been larger than Libya and Asia combined, while the immense extent of the Atlantic Ocean provided ample physical space for the additional subject territories that Plato had attributed to Atlantean control. Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo's General and Natural History of the Indies offered an even more systematic, detailed analysis of these striking parallels between Platonic descriptions and American realities. Oviedo, who spent several decades in the New World, carefully documenting indigenous cultures, languages, and natural phenomena, identified numerous specific correspondences that suggested direct historical connections between Plato's Atlantis and pre-Columbian civilizations. He noted remarkable similarities in advanced metallurgical techniques, agricultural practices, and architectural styles that could not easily be dismissed as mere historical coincidence. The discovery of advanced hydraulic engineering in various American cultures provided particularly striking parallels to Plato's description of Atlantean water management. The elaborate canal systems of the Aztec capital, the sophisticated irrigation networks developed by Andean civilizations, and the complex harbor facilities found at various coastal sites all demonstrated engineering capabilities that perfectly matched or exceeded those attributed to the legendary Lost Empire. To Renaissance observers, these technological parallels suggested that the ancient inhabitants of the Americas possessed the exact advanced knowledge that would have been strictly necessary to construct the elaborate, monumental infrastructure described so meticulously in the Critias. As the deep stillness of the night settles completely over the landscape, let your thoughts release the active calculations of the waking world. The creaking timber of early explorer ships, the mapping of unknown coastlines under starlit skies, and the silent ruins of ancient jungle cities fade softly into the background of your consciousness, leaving only the peaceful, regular breathing of the present moment. The intense excitement of old discoveries and the grand geographical puzzles of the past rest quietly beneath the open sky, suspended in a timeless harmony that spans across the centuries. Let the profound, comforting stability of this quiet night wrap around you like a protective shield under the warm covers, allowing the slow, steady rhythm of time to carry your mind away into a deep, peaceful, and undisturbed sleep. The compelling geographical parallels discovered in the New World forced European intellectuals to construct comprehensive frameworks capable of explaining the long-term relationships between classical accounts of lost civilizations and contemporary American realities. In his landmark work, Historia Natural y Moral de las Indias, published in the year 1590, the Spanish scholar José de Acosta attempted to resolve these cross-continental mysteries. Acosta argued that the Americas had originally been populated by successive, ancient waves of migration originating from the Old World. He suggested that some of these early maritime travelers might have carried deep historical memories of vanished civilizations, which ultimately seeded and influenced the development of indigenous American cultures. This sophisticated migration theory provided a logical mechanism for explaining the apparent parallels between Platonic descriptions and American realities without requiring an unbroken, direct historical continuity. However, these early anthropological theories immediately collided with severe chronological difficulties that threatened to dismantle the entire framework of Eurocentric history. Plato's explicit dating of the destruction of Atlantis to approximately 9,600 years before his own era, or roughly the year 9,500, before Christ created an immediate intense crisis for Renaissance chronographers, working strictly within rigid biblical frameworks that place the literal creation of humanity and the cosmos only a few millennia before the Christian era. Scholars struggled desperately to accommodate Plato's immense timeline while maintaining the historical accuracy and divine authority of scriptural accounts. To resolve this profound structural conflict, Renaissance intellectuals split into different schools of interpretation. Some practical scholars argued that Plato, or his Greek predecessors, had fundamentally misunderstood the complex Egyptian chronological systems, suggesting that the priests of Sais had recorded lunar cycles or shorter seasonal units rather than full solar years. By systematically reducing the timeline through mathematical recalculations, they attempted to bring the Atlantis story closer to known historical periods. Other, more traditional theologians suggested that the narrative referred directly to more recent, pre-Columbian historical events that had simply been artificially antiquated through centuries of fluid oral transmission, transforming a regional coastal migration into an ancient global cataclysm. The raging debate over the authenticity of the Atlantis narrative was further complicated by the linguistic and cultural evidence gathered by early ethnographers working throughout the Americas. Early European missionaries and colonial administrators noted what they believed to be striking, systematic similarities between certain indigenous American languages and Old World linguistic families. They argued that these apparent philological connections provided concrete, empirical proof of a shared, ancestral Atlantic civilization that had existed before the great separation of the continents. While these superficial linguistic parallels would later be proven largely illusory by modern scientific philology, they provided contemporary Renaissance scholars with powerful, emotionally compelling evidence for treating the Atlantis narrative as an authentic, historically grounded record rather than a purely fictional philosophical allegory. The material remnants of the New World, from its massive terraced pyramids to its sophisticated irrigation networks, were continuously viewed through the romantic lens of Platonic history, transforming the unknown spaces of the American continent into a tangible, living monument to the lost greatness of the prehistoric past. As the deep stillness of the night settles completely over the landscape, let your thoughts release the active calculations of the waking mind. The heavy volumes of the old chronographers, the complex charts of ancient world timelines, and the silent libraries of the Renaissance world fade softly into the background of your consciousness, leaving only the peaceful, regular breathing of the present moment. The intense historical debates of the past and the grand chronological puzzles of forgotten eras rest quietly beneath the starlit sky, suspended in a timeless harmony that spans across the centuries. Let the profound, comforting stability of this quiet night wrap around you like a protective shield under the warm covers, allowing the slow, steady rhythm of time to carry your mind away into a deep, peaceful, and undisturbed sleep. The intellectual ferment of the 17th and 18th centuries transformed European approaches to ancient texts and historical claims with unprecedented rigor. The scientific revolution's heavy emphasis on empirical observation and systematic methodology created entirely new frameworks for evaluating historical narratives, while expanding geographical knowledge provided fresh contexts for interpreting ancient accounts of distant lands. Within this transformed intellectual landscape, the Atlantis narrative encountered both vigorous scholarly investigation and increasingly sophisticated criticism as Enlightenment thinkers applied emerging standards of evidence and reasoning to Plato's ancient account. The Swedish scholar Olaus Rudbeck emerged as perhaps the most ambitious and systematic proponent of Atlantis theories during this period. His monumental work, Atlantica, published in 4 massive volumes between the years 1679 and 1702, represented an extraordinary, highly detailed attempt to completely relocate Plato's lost civilization within the familiar, cold geography of Scandinavia. Rudbeck, who held the prestigious chair of medicine at Uppsala University and possessed extensive knowledge of Nordic archaeology, botany, and linguistics, developed an elaborate, comprehensive theory identifying Sweden as the original, primordial Atlantis described by Plato. Rudbeck's bold identification of Sweden with the lost empire rested upon a highly complex, multi-layered, philological argument that traced the very name of Atlantis through various linguistic transformations to Atland, which he interpreted as an ancient, foundational designation for Swedish territory. He argued with immense passion that classical Greek and Egyptian authors had systematically misunderstood the geographical references in ancient source materials, placing Atlantis in the distant Atlantic Ocean when the original accounts actually referred to the Baltic Sea region. According to Rudbeck's creative geographical reconstruction, the Pillars of Hercules, mentioned so prominently by Plato, did not refer to the Strait of Gibraltar at all, but rather to a specific northern geographical feature, possibly the narrow, treacherous passages between the Danish islands or the entrance to the Baltic Sea itself. The archaeological evidence that Rudbeck marshaled in support of his ambitious theory beautifully reflected the limited but growing knowledge of Scandinavian prehistory available in the late 17th century. He pointed with great pride to the numerous Bronze Age burial mounds scattered extensively across the Swedish landscape, particularly around Old Uppsala, interpreting them as concrete physical evidence of an ancient civilization of extraordinary sophistication, age, and material wealth. The elaborate grave goods discovered within these royal burials, including intricate metalwork, golden ornaments, and imported materials from distant regions, suggested to Rudbeck a level of cultural development and international trade connections that perfectly matched Plato's descriptions of Atlantean prosperity and global influence. Rudbeck's detailed linguistic analysis extended far beyond simple etymological connections to encompass a comprehensive, sweeping theory about the historical relationship between ancient Swedish and classical languages. He argued that many fundamental terms in Greek and Latin, and indeed the very structures of classical mythology, actually derived from Proto-Germanic roots perfectly preserved in the Old Swedish tongue, suggesting that Scandinavian civilization had provided the cultural foundation for classical Mediterranean societies rather than the reverse. This linguistic priority, according to Rudbeck's framework, explained how ancient Swedish traditions about their own glorious, forgotten past had eventually migrated southward to reach the Egyptian priests of Sais, and ultimately influenced Plato's dialogues. The specific geographical features of Sweden and its surrounding territories provided Rudbeck with numerous striking parallels to Plato's description of the Atlantean capital. The highly complex archipelago systems along Sweden's eastern coast, with their intricate patterns of islands, narrow straits, and sheltered, concentric harbours, seem to beautifully echo the mathematical rings of land and water that Plato attributed to the citadel of Poseidon. Furthermore, the extensive lake systems of central Sweden, connected by deep rivers and navigable waterways, offered a highly plausible model for the elaborate, massive canal networks that Plato described as facilitating both rapid transportation and agricultural irrigation throughout the Atlantean plains. As the deep silence of midnight blankets the ancient, quiet landscapes of our world, let your thoughts release the active calculations of the waking mind. The towering burial mounds of the old northern kings, the heavy, leather-bound volumes of the Atlantica, and the cold, dark waters of the Baltic Sea fade softly into the background of your consciousness, leaving only the peaceful, regular breathing of the present moment. The intense national prides of the past, the grand linguistic puzzles, and the geometric maps of forgotten northern empires rest quietly beneath the starlit sky, suspended in a timeless harmony that spans across the vast ocean of time. Let the profound, comforting stability of this quiet night wrap around you like a protective shield under the warm covers, allowing the slow, steady rhythm of time to carry your mind away into a deep, peaceful, and undisturbed sleep. The sweeping claims made by Olaus Rudbeck regarding a Scandinavian Atlantis did not long endure without facing severe intellectual blowback from the emerging giants of European rationalism. As the late 17th century shifted into the dawn of the Enlightenment, the methodological standards for evaluating ancient history and philological evidence became rapidly formalized. The German polymath and philosopher Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, despite expressing a profound and genuine admiration for Rudbeck's immense erudition and wide reading, raised highly critical, public doubts regarding the linguistic connections that formed the very foundation of the Swedish scholar's historical architecture. Leibniz noted with a sharp, analytical precision that Rudbeck's loose etymological methods were fundamentally flawed, demonstrating that similar arbitrary linguistic manipulations could be used to connect virtually any modern European language with ancient classical terms. Without independent, corroborating empirical evidence or explicit external historical documentation, such philological gymnastics remained inherently unreliable, serving the interests of national prestige rather than the cold pursuit of scientific truth. This methodological critique marked a broader intellectual turning point, signaling that the era of accepting romantic, unverified origins for ancient texts was drawing to a close. As the 18th century advanced, this growing atmosphere of rigorous academic doubt found its most devastatingly witty and systematic voice in the writings of Voltaire. Within his highly celebrated work, The Essay on the Manners and Spirit of Nations, Voltaire subjected the Atlantis narrative to a clinical, rationalistic evaluation that completely dismantled any claims of literal historical authenticity. Rather than attempting to map the lost continent onto known geographical coordinates or seeking to salvage parts of the timeline, Voltaire analyzed the structural inner mechanics of the text itself, highlighting its deep internal contradictions, its wild chronological improbabilities, and the absolute, devastating absence of any corroborating records within other contemporary ancient civilizations. To Voltaire, the story of Atlantis was not a garbled memory of a prehistoric catastrophe, nor was it an ancient piece of hidden historical data mistakenly preserved by Egyptian priests. It was a brilliant, highly tailored, and purely literary device manufactured solely by the mind of Plato to serve as an extended political fable. Voltaire argued that the entire structure of the Critias dialogue, with its hypersymmetric, concentric rings of water, its beautifully arranged million-man armies, and its convenient, sudden disappearance beneath the waves, bore all the unmistakable hallmarks of a tailored academic utopia designed to critique the real-world corruption of contemporary Greek democracies. To mistake this beautifully crafted philosophical allegory for literal factual history was, in Voltaire's view, a profound failure of critical reasoning that ignored the fundamental pedagogical methods of the classical world. This aggressive Enlightenment skepticism was heavily reinforced by the rapid maturation of historical historiography as a rigorous academic discipline. Historians like Edward Gibbon, whose landmark work, The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, established entirely new benchmarks for source criticism, demonstrated how the meticulous, clinical evaluation of conflicting accounts could separate genuine historical facts from the enduring power of myth and literary embellishment. When these modern historical methods were applied directly to the Atlantis account, the narrative's isolation became glaringly obvious. The complete lack of any structural footprint in the physical world, or any cross-cultural verification from neighboring ancient societies, increasingly relegated the lost continent to the realm of pure philosophical abstraction among the elite intelligentsia of Europe. Simultaneously, the steady expansion of global geographical knowledge continuously squeezed the physical plausibility of an undiscovered Atlantic empire. The pioneering voyages of Captain James Cook and other European navigators across the vast, uncharted stretches of the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans were systematically mapping the true boundaries of the globe with unprecedented precision. While these maritime explorations frequently uncovered highly sophisticated, isolated island societies that demonstrated the remarkable adaptability of human culture, they found absolutely no trace, no underwater shoal, and no regional tradition that could support the existence of a massive, vanished superpower in the Western Ocean. The physical maps of the world were becoming crowded, dense, and scientifically fixed, leaving less and less room for the romantic mysteries of the ancient past to hide. As the deep stillness of the night settles completely over the landscape, let your thoughts release the active calculations of the waking mind. The sharp, cutting arguments of the old philosophers, the clinical critiques of the Enlightenment libraries, and the orderly lines of modern scientific maps fade softly into the background of your consciousness, leaving only the peaceful, regular breathing of the present moment. The intense intellectual debates of the past and the grand structural questions of long-lost oceans rest quietly beneath the starlit sky, suspended in a timeless harmony that spans across the vast ocean of time. Let the profound, comforting stability of this classical order wrap around you like a protective shield under the warm covers, allowing the slow, steady rhythm of time to carry your mind away into a deep, peaceful, and undisturbed sleep. As the late 18th century shifted toward a more mature, scientific understanding of the natural world, the structural analysis of the Atlantis narrative migrated from the studies of philologists into the field of early evolutionary geology and earth sciences. French naturalists began to evaluate Plato's text not merely as an isolated piece of classical literature, but as a potential historical key to unlocking the violent, prehistoric physical transformations of the planet. The pioneering geologist Georges-Louis Leclerc, Comte de Buffon, whose monumental multi-volume work, Histoire naturelle, challenged traditional timelines of Earth history, integrated the concept of vanished landmasses into his groundbreaking theories regarding the gradual cooling of the planet and the shifting boundaries of global oceans. Buffon posited that the current distribution of continents was the result of a long, dynamic sequence of geological epochs, during which immense land bridges and vast islands had risen from and sunk beneath the global waters due to seismic contractions and crustal shifts. Within this early scientific framework, the sudden cataclysm of Atlantis was stripped of its mythological, divine execution by Poseidon and reinterpreted as a highly plausible, natural manifestation of post-glacial geological activity. Buffon suggested that the rising sea levels following the retreat of the great northern ice sheets, combined with systemic underwater volcanic eruptions, could easily have overwhelmed and completely submerged massive coastal territories in the Atlantic region, leaving behind the distorted memory of a lost empire that eventually filtered down into the temple archives of Egypt. This early geological approach was embraced and pushed into more speculative territories by the French astronomer and politician Jean-Sylvain Bailly. In a famous series of public letters exchanged with Voltaire, Bailly developed an elaborate, highly controversial hypothesis that sought to harmonize Platonic geography with astronomical calculations and early ethnographic data. Bailly argued that the cradle of human civilization was not located in the Mediterranean basin or the river valleys of Mesopotamia, but rather in the extreme northern regions of Siberia and the Arctic Circle, which he believed had possessed a warm, temperate, and hyper-fertile climate during the early epochs of human development. According to Bailly's striking reconstruction, this advanced primordial Hyperborean civilization was forced to migrate southward as the upper latitudes of the planet gradually cooled and became trapped in permanent ice. During this long generational migration, a powerful branch of these ancient people established a magnificent, highly sophisticated maritime empire centered on a massive island plateau within the North Atlantic Ocean. It was this secondary colonial state that eventually grew into the aggressive, ostentatious superpower described by Plato as Atlantis. The sudden, violent destruction of this island nation beneath the waves was caused, in Bailly's view, by a sudden, catastrophic shift in the Earth's axis of rotation, an astronomical event that triggered massive global tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, and widespread structural changes across the oceanic boundaries of the world. Bailly's highly creative synthesis of astronomy, geology, and classical mythology represented an early attempt to utilize cutting-edge scientific principles to defend the fundamental historical truth of ancient legends. By providing a natural, cosmic mechanism for the sudden disappearance of an entire continent, he sought to rescue Plato's account from the absolute skepticism of Enlightenment critics like Voltaire. His theories illustrated a growing intellectual desire within pre-revolutionary Europe to construct a unified, grand history of human civilization, one that could bridge the deep, terrifying voids of geological time with the fragile, written records of early human memory. However, as the 19th century dawned, these early oceanographic and astronomical speculations were rapidly overtaken by the formalization of modern stratigraphic geology and the introduction of strict empirical observation. The emerging scientific consensus increasingly demanded that any claims regarding vanished landmasses be backed by direct, physical evidence gathered from the deep ocean floor itself, rather than from the creative reinterpretation of ancient texts. The romantic, sweeping hypotheses of Buffon and Bailly had successfully kept the mystery of Atlantis alive within the European imagination, but they also set the stage for an intense, century-long battle between professional academic researchers and popular, visionary outsiders who sought to rewrite the prehistoric timeline of humanity. As the deep stillness of the night settles completely over the landscape, let your thoughts release the active calculations of the waking mind, the bold hypotheses of the early geologists, the sweeping astronomical calculations of the old observatories, and the quiet movements of deep oceanic currents fade softly into the background of your consciousness, leaving only the peaceful, regular breathing of the present moment, the grand structural mysteries of the planet's deep past, and the quiet thoughts of long-ago scholars rest peacefully beneath the starlit sky, suspended in a timeless harmony that spans across the centuries. Let the profound, comforting stability of this quiet night wrap around you like a protective shield under the warm covers, allowing the slow, steady rhythm of time to carry your mind away into a deep, peaceful, and undisturbed sleep. The publication of Atlantis, The antediluvian world, in the year 1882, marked a seismic shift in how the Western world understood and interpreted Plato's ancient narrative. Ignatius Donnelly, a charismatic former congressman from Minnesota with no formal training in archaeology or ancient history, produced a work that would fundamentally reshape popular conceptions of human prehistory and establish enduring mythologies about lost civilizations that persist to this day. His 500-page tome, dense with citations, maps, and comparative analyses, presented itself as rigorous scholarship while advancing theories that professional archaeologists and historians found deeply problematic. Donnelly's background as a populist politician, rather than an academic scholar, profoundly influenced his approach to the Atlantis question. Born in Philadelphia in the year 1831, he had built his career on challenging established authorities and championing the common man against entrenched elites. His political experience in Minnesota, territorial politics, and his 3 terms in the United States House of Representatives had honed his skills in persuasive rhetoric and popular communication. When he turned his attention to ancient history, he brought the same combative spirit and popular sensibilities that had characterized his political career, positioning himself as a truth-telling outsider, challenging the dogmas of the academic establishments. The intellectual climate of the 1880s provided fertile ground for Donnelly's revolutionary claims about human prehistory. Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species had fundamentally altered scientific understanding of human development, while archaeological discoveries across Europe, Egypt, and the Americas were revealing evidence of sophisticated ancient civilizations that challenged traditional biblical chronologies. The general public, educated enough to follow scientific developments, but lacking specialized knowledge to evaluate competing claims, proved remarkably receptive to bold new theories that promised to explain mysterious archaeological phenomena and ancient myths within comprehensive theoretical frameworks. Donnelly's central thesis rested on the proposition that Plato's Atlantis had been a real historical civilization whose destruction, approximately 11,000 years ago, had scattered survivors across the globe, carrying advanced knowledge and cultural practices that became the foundation for all subsequent human civilizations. This catastrophic dispersal, according to Donnelly, explained the remarkable similarities he claimed to observe between ancient cultures separated by vast geographical distances. Rather than viewing these similarities as evidence of independent human development or later cultural contact, Donnelly argued they represented the fragmentary preservation of a common Atlantean heritage. The methodological approach that Donnelly employed in constructing his argument combined selective citation of legitimate archaeological and ethnographic sources with speculative interpretations that extended far beyond what the evidence could reasonably support. He demonstrated remarkable industry in gathering comparative material from diverse cultures, citing everything from Aztec creation myths to Egyptian pyramid construction techniques to Celtic folklore. However, his analysis consistently emphasized superficial similarities while ignoring fundamental differences, and he showed little concern for the chronological contexts that would have been essential for establishing actual historical connections. Donnelly's treatment of flood myths provided a representative example of his methodology. He compiled extensive lists of flood narratives from cultures around the world, noting apparent similarities in their descriptions of worldwide catastrophes that destroyed earlier civilizations. From these parallels, he argued that all flood myths preserved distorted memories of the actual destruction of Atlantis, transmitted through oral traditions by scattered survivors. This interpretation allowed him to treat diverse mythological traditions as corroborating historical evidence, while dismissing the obvious differences between various flood narratives as minor corruptions introduced during centuries of oral transmission. As the deep stillness of the night settles completely over the landscape, let your thoughts release the active calculations of the waking mind. The dense pages of old Victorian volumes, the echo of fiery political debates in long-ago congresses, and the grand, far-flung maps of hypothetical ancient empires fade softly into the background of your consciousness, leaving only the peaceful, regular breathing of the present moment. The intense cultural anxieties of the late 19th century and the sprawling, mysterious timelines of human prehistory rest quietly beneath the starlit sky, suspended in a timeless harmony that spans across the vast ocean of time. Let the profound, comforting stability of this quiet night wrap around you like a protective shield under the warm covers, allowing the slow, steady rhythm of time to carry your mind away into a deep, peaceful, and undisturbed sleep. The widespread commercial success of Ignatius Donnelly's work throughout the late 19th century heavily depended on his ability to present complex linguistic and architectural patterns as undeniable, physical proof of a singular mother civilization. The linguistic evidence that Donnelly marshaled in support of his theories reflected both the bold, expansive ambitions and the severe structural weaknesses of Victorian comparative philology. He systematically identified hundreds of words from entirely different language families that appeared to share similar phonetic structures and meanings, arguing with populist conviction that these correspondences demonstrated a direct descent from a common Atlantean ancestor. His etymological analyses ranged from plausible connections between historically related Indo-European languages to wildly speculative derivations that linked completely unrelated Native American linguistic families with ancient Mediterranean tongues through long chains of hypothetical sound changes. Professional linguists of the late 19th century immediately recognized that Donnelly's loose, undisciplined methods could be used to prove virtually any desired relationship between any two languages on Earth, making his sprawling comparative charts essentially meaningless from a rigorous, scholarly perspective. He consistently elevated superficial homophones, words that merely sounded alike by pure statistical coincidence, into deep historical proof, completely ignoring the complex structural grammar and internal evolutionary laws that define the true development of human speech. The architectural parallels that formed another massive pillar of Donnelly's global argument drew heavily upon the rapidly growing body of archaeological knowledge regarding ancient monumental construction and prehistoric engineering techniques. He noted with great rhetorical flourish that civilizations as structurally diverse and geographically isolated as the ancient Egyptians, the Mesoamerican Maya, and various European megalithic builders had all constructed massive stone pyramids and mounds using highly sophisticated mathematical and alignment techniques. These striking similarities, according to Donnelly's framework, could not possibly be explained by independent human innovation or regional adaptation. They could only be explained by assuming that all these disparate cultures had inherited their monumental architectural blueprints from a highly trained core of Atlantean colonists who had successfully escaped the great prehistoric cataclysm. Donnelly's specific analysis of pyramid construction proved particularly influential in establishing lasting popular mythologies around ancient mysteries and hidden engineering wisdom. He argued that the extreme mathematical precision evident in the layout of the Great Pyramid of Giza, combined with the terraced stone structures discovered within the jungles of Mexico, demonstrated the global dissemination of a singular, highly advanced Atlantean architectural science. His detailed calculations of pyramid dimensions, tracking astronomical alignments and geometric ratios, while often mathematically accurate in isolation, were continuously extended into speculative interpretations about encoded ancient secrets that went far beyond what the physical archaeological evidence could ever support. He systematically ignored the well-documented, gradual evolution of these structures within their own regional contexts, such as the clear progression in Egypt from simple mastaba tombs to the step pyramid of Djoser, and finally to the smooth-sided pyramids of Giza. By treating these independent, centuries-long human achievements as sudden, perfect gifts from an external master civilization, Donnelly's popular work helped establish a highly persistent, romantic trope that would heavily influence subsequent generations of alternative historians, esoteric writers, and popular culture long after his own lifetime. As the deep stillness of the night settles completely over the landscape, let your thoughts release the active calculations of the waking mind. The sprawling comparative charts of old philologists, the massive stone profiles of distant jungle pyramids, and the heavy volumes of Victorian speculation fade softly into the background of your consciousness, leaving only the peaceful, regular breathing of the present moment. The intense intellectual debates of the past and the grand architectural puzzles of forgotten eras rest quietly beneath the starlit sky, suspended in a timeless harmony that spans across the vast ocean of time. Let the profound, comforting stability of this quiet night wrap around you like a protective shield under the warm covers, allowing the slow, steady rhythm of time to carry your mind away into a deep, peaceful, and undisturbed sleep. The transformation of Atlantis from Ignatius Donnelly's pseudo-archaeological construct into a foundational cornerstone of modern occult doctrine began with Helena Petrovna Blavatsky's ambitious synthesis of Eastern philosophy, Western esotericism, and speculative anthropology in the late 1800s. Blavatsky, a Russian aristocrat turned spiritual teacher, possessed an extraordinary talent for weaving together disparate religious and philosophical traditions into comprehensive cosmological systems that promised to reveal hidden truths about human spiritual evolution. Her monumental work, The Secret Doctrine, published in the year 1888, elevated Atlantis from a lost physical civilization into a crucial stage in humanity's cosmic development, establishing interpretive frameworks that would influence esoteric thought for more than a century. Blavatsky's approach to Atlantis differed fundamentally from Donnelly's archaeological methodology, drawing instead on claimed access to ancient wisdom preserved in hidden Tibetan monasteries and transmitted through psychic revelation. She asserted that her teachings derived directly from the Akashic records, a cosmic repository of all human experiences, thoughts, and historical events, accessible exclusively through advanced spiritual development and from direct communication with Mahatmas, ascended masters, who guided human evolution from hidden retreats in the Himalayas. This claimed supernatural authority allowed her to present highly detailed accounts of Atlantean civilization without relying on conventional historical evidence, positioning her revelations as superior to both academic scholarship and popular speculation. The doctrine of root races formed the theoretical foundation of Blavatsky's Atlantis teachings, providing a rigid framework that connected individual spiritual development with massive cosmic evolutionary cycles. According to theosophical cosmology, humanity progressed through 7 distinct root races, each representing a different stage of physical and spiritual evolution, occurring over millions of years. The 4th root race, known as the Atlanteans, had inhabited the Earth during a period when the planet's geography, climate, and spiritual conditions differed dramatically from contemporary circumstances. These beings possessed physical and psychic capabilities that modern humans had largely lost, representing both an evolutionary peak and a cautionary example of complete spiritual failure. The Atlantean root race, as described in theosophical literature, encompassed several subraces that developed different characteristics and capabilities over millions of years. The earliest Atlanteans were giants possessing natural psychic powers, direct communion with spiritual hierarchies, and technological capabilities that operated through spiritual rather than mechanical principles. Their civilization reached heights of material and spiritual achievement that surpassed anything known to recorded history, with cities of crystalline beauty, flying vehicles powered by spiritual energy, and social systems based on direct psychic communication between individuals and governing councils. Blavatsky's description of Atlantean technology emphasized its integration with spiritual principles rather than mechanical engineering. The Atlanteans supposedly powered their vehicles and machinery through the manipulation of subtle energies that modern science had not yet discovered, using crystals and sound vibrations to achieve effects that contemporary technology accomplished through crude mechanical means. Their architecture incorporated sacred geometry and harmonic principles that created buildings serving simultaneously as functional spaces and spiritual instruments, with temples that could amplify psychic abilities and facilitate communication with higher spiritual planes. As the deep stillness of the night settles completely over the landscape, let your thoughts release the active calculations of the waking mind. The dense, mystical text of old occult volumes, the glowing crystals of theosophical lore, and the quiet movements of ancient spiritual masters fade softly into the background of your consciousness, leaving only the peaceful, regular breathing of the present moment. The grand cosmic dramas of the past and the long-lost records of ancient root races rest quietly beneath the starlit sky, suspended in a timeless harmony that spans across the vast ocean of time. Let the profound, comforting stability of this quiet night wrap around you like a protective shield under the warm covers, allowing the slow, steady rhythm of time to carry your mind away into a deep, peaceful, and undisturbed sleep. The esoteric transformation of the Atlantis narrative reached an even more systematic, psychological depth through the work of Rudolf Steiner in the early decades of the 20th century. Steiner, an Austrian philosopher, scientist, and founder of anthroposophy, originally operated as a leading figure within the German section of the Theosophical Society, before breaking away to establish his own independent spiritual movement. Like Blavatsky, Steiner claimed direct, conscious access to the Akashic Chronicles, but he approached these cosmic archives with a unique, intensely detailed phenomenological focus, seeking to describe the everyday life, inner consciousness, and cognitive evolution of the Atlantean peoples, with the precision of a spiritual scientist. Steiner's detailed descriptions of Atlantis, published in a series of essays eventually compiled as Cosmic Memory, presented a humanity whose psychological and physiological structures differed fundamentally from modern human beings. According to Steiner's spiritual observations, the inhabitants of the lost continent possessed a highly advanced, instinctive memory system that operated independently of the abstract intellectual reasoning that characterizes contemporary thought. An Atlantean did not calculate or apply logical formulas to solve practical problems. Instead, they simply recalled a vivid, exact mental picture of a past event or a natural process and replicated it to meet the needs of the present moment, relying on a beautiful, visual harmony with the memory of the Earth itself. This unique cognitive structure was intrinsically linked to a completely different relationship with the natural world and its living forces. Steiner asserted that the Atlanteans possessed the remarkable ability to control and utilize what he termed the life forces, or vril energy inherent within growing plant matter and running water. Their unique technology did not depend on burning fossil fuels, manipulating electricity, or extracting metallic ores from the earth. Instead, they engineered sophisticated, organic machinery that could hook directly into the vital energy of germinating seeds and the natural currents of the environment, powering their massive civil works, illuminating their crystalline cities, and propelling their silent, wingless airships across the sky using the raw, uncorrupted currents of nature. The physical landscape of Steiner's Atlantis was characterized by a continuous, intense mutability, where the boundaries between solid earth, heavy mist, and open water remained remarkably fluid. The atmosphere of the continent was described as a dense, hyperhumid blanket of heavy fog and warm vapors, an environmental condition that allowed the physical bodies of the early Atlanteans to remain highly malleable and uniquely responsive to their inner spiritual states. In this early evolutionary epoch, the human form had not yet fully hardened into the rigid, skeletal, and muscular structures of today. A person's physical appearance, stature, and facial features could actively change over time, mirroring the moral qualities, creative willpower, and spiritual development of their individual soul. However, this profound organic connection to the life forces of the cosmos eventually became the very instrument of their civilizational ruin. Steiner's narrative details a gradual, tragic moral decline that mirrors classical warnings while adding a distinct psychological dimension. As the long generations advanced, a powerful segment of the Atlantean priesthood and ruling elite began to detach their formidable psychic capabilities from the selfless service of the cosmic order, utilizing their mastery over the vril forces to satisfy private ambitions, exploit their fellow citizens, and assert an absolute, tyrannical dominion over the natural world. This systemic misuse of life energies introduced a profound, destructive disharmony into the delicate equilibrium of the Earth's biosphere. By manipulating the vital forces of nature for selfish, destructive purposes, the rogue Atlantean sorcerers unwittingly triggered a series of massive, uncontrollable reactions within the elemental kingdoms of the planet. The corrupted life energies, severed from their divine alignment, reacted violently with the subterranean volcanic networks and the vast oceanic currents surrounding the continent. This internal, elemental imbalance eventually culminated in a long, catastrophic sequence of tectonic fractures and colossal floods that systematically tore the landmass apart over centuries, serving as a permanent spiritual lesson that any technological mastery over nature, when entirely divorced from moral virtue and cosmic responsibility, will inevitably collapse under the weight of its own hubris. As the deep stillness of the night settles completely over the landscape, let your thoughts release the active calculations of the waking mind. The complex spiritual charts of the old philosophers, the silent, misty landscapes of ancient continents, and the slow, rhythmic breathing of the present moment merge into a peaceful sanctuary of rest. The grand cosmic cycles of the past and the long-forgotten paths of human consciousness rest quietly beneath the starlight, suspended in a timeless harmony that spans across the vast ocean of time. Let the profound, comforting stability of this quiet night wrap around you like a protective shield under the warm covers, allowing the slow, steady rhythm of time to carry your mind away into a deep, peaceful, and undisturbed sleep. The migration of the Atlantis narrative into modern American pop spirituality found its most prolific voice in the work of Edgar Cayce, widely known as the Sleeping Prophet. Operating from Virginia Beach during the first half of the 20th century, Cayce gave thousands of life readings while in a self-induced hypnotic trance. In these readings, he laid out an incredibly detailed history of Atlantis, describing it as a highly advanced, technological civilization that flourished for tens of thousands of years before its final destruction around 10,000 before Christ. According to Cayce, the Atlanteans possessed a level of sophistication that rivaled or exceeded 20th century technology, featuring lasers, aircraft, and a massive power source known as the Great Crystal or the Tuaoi Stone, which accidentally caused the continent's ruin when it was tuned to an excessively high frequency. What set Cayce's readings apart from previous occult interpretations was his explicit, testable geographic predictions. In the late 1940s, Cayce prophesied that the western portions of Atlantis would begin to rise again near the Bahamas, stating that Pisidia will be among the first portions of Atlantis to rise again, expected in 68 or 69. This specific timeline turned his mystical readings into a tangible countdown, capturing the imagination of a generation that was rapidly becoming obsessed with ancient mysteries, deep-sea exploration, and alternative histories. The prophecy seemed to achieve a spectacular, physical validation in September of the year 1968. A marine biologist and pilot named Manson Valentine, while flying over the shallow waters off North Bimini Island in the Bahamas, noticed a striking, geometric formation submerged beneath the turquoise waves. Subsequent diving expeditions revealed a massive half-mile-long underwater line of large, rectangular limestone blocks that appeared to form a paved highway, a collapsed defensive wall, or a monumental pier. Dubbed the Bimini Road, this dramatic discovery sent shockwaves through popular culture, with enthusiasts loudly proclaiming that the ruins of Cayce's lost temple of Pisidia had finally been uncovered exactly where and when the prophet had predicted. The discovery triggered an intense, decades-long battle between mainstream marine geologists and alternative archaeologists. Professional researchers who conducted core drilling and microscopic analysis on the Bimini blocks concluded that the formation was entirely natural. They identified it as beach rock, a heavy parallel fracture pattern of limestone that forms rapidly beneath coastal sands through natural chemical cementation, eventually eroding and cracking into neat, geometric blocks that mimic human masonry. Despite these empirical explanations, the Bimini Road remained a powerful cultural symbol, anchoring Cayce's psychic visions to a tangible physical location and proving that the hunger for a real, discoverable Atlantis could still reshape how humanity looks at the silent depths of the ocean floor. As the deep stillness of the night settles completely over the landscape, let your thoughts release the active calculations of the waking mind. The rhythmic hum of old prophecy halls, the gentle lapping of warm Bahamian waves over sunlit stones, and the deep, silent turquoise of the ocean floor fade softly into the background of your consciousness, leaving only the peaceful, regular breathing of the present moment. The grand mysteries of lost continents and the long-ago predictions of quiet dreamers rest peacefully beneath the starlit sky, suspended in a timeless harmony that spans across the vast expanse of time. Let the profound, comforting stability of this quiet night wrap around you like a protective shield under the warm covers, allowing the slow, steady rhythm of time to carry your mind away into a deep, peaceful, and undisturbed sleep. As modern archaeological science matured in the mid-20th century, researchers sought to bridge the immense gap between Plato's grand philosophical allegory and genuine historical catastrophes of the ancient Mediterranean. The most compelling empirically grounded framework to emerge was the Minoan hypothesis, which identifies the legendary lost empire of Atlantis with the brilliant Bronze Age civilization of Crete and its surrounding islands, particularly the volcanic outpost of Thera, known today as Santorini. This theory strips the narrative of its far-flung Atlantic coordinates and repositions it within a real, localized geographical crisis that profoundly reshaped the trajectory of early European history. The Minoan civilization, which flourished between 2700 and 1450 before Christ, was a magnificent maritime superpower that perfectly mirrored the structural sophistication Plato attributed to Atlantis. From their sprawling, multi-story palaces at Knossos and Phaistos, the Minoans commanded an unparalleled naval network that dominated the Aegean Sea, established rich commercial trade routes with New Kingdom Egypt, and excelled in advanced hydraulic engineering, elaborate drainage systems, and breathtaking frescoes. Like the early Atlanteans, their prosperity was deeply rooted in their control of the seas and their highly organized administrative bureaucracy, which allowed them to construct an ostentatious, wealthy society that seemed completely invincible to contemporary observers. The sudden, catastrophic undoing of this Bronze Age golden age began around 1600, before Christ, with the colossal eruption of the Thera volcano, one of the most violent volcanic events in the recorded history of human civilization. The cataclysmic blast tore the island of Thera completely apart, collapsing its central caldera beneath the sea and launching an unimaginable plume of ash, rock, and toxic gases into the stratosphere that blackened the Mediterranean skies for days. The sudden displacement of the seabed triggered monstrous tsunamis, with waves estimated at over 50 feet high, crashing violently into the northern coast of Crete, obliterating the vital Minoan harbour facilities, shattering their formidable merchant fleets, and drowning their highly populated coastal commercial hubs in a matter of hours. This sudden marine inundation and the subsequent economic collapse offer a striking, mathematically plausible real-world counterpart to Plato's description of an empire swallowed by the sea in a single day and night of misfortune. Proponents of the Minoan hypothesis argue that memories of this terrifying Bronze Age disaster were preserved through centuries of fluid oral tradition within Egypt, where scribes recorded the sudden disappearance of their primary maritime trading partners to the north. When Solon visited Egypt 9 centuries later, he likely encountered these fragmented historical records. However, due to systemic linguistic translation errors or a misunderstanding of Egyptian numerical symbols, the scale of the timeline was artificially multiplied by 10, transforming a real event that occurred 900 years prior into an ancient myth dating back 9,000 years, and expanding a localized Aegean crisis into a global Atlantic catastrophe. As the deep stillness of the night settles completely over the landscape, let your thoughts release the active calculations of the waking mind, the thundering echoes of ancient volcanic blasts, the gentle lapping of Aegean waves over sun-drenched ruins, and the soft patterns of Minoan frescoes fade softly into the background of your consciousness, leaving only the peaceful, regular breathing of the present moment, the grand civilizational puzzles of the past, and the silent, deep waters of the Mediterranean rest quietly beneath the starlit sky, suspended in a timeless harmony that spans across the vast expanse of time. Let the profound, comforting stability of this quiet night wrap around you like a protective shield under the warm covers, allowing the slow, steady rhythm of time to carry your mind away into a deep, peaceful, and undisturbed sleep. The journey of Atlantis through the long corridors of human history ultimately leads away from physical oceanography and deep into the architecture of the human psyche. In the modern era, the lost continent has achieved a profound, permanent status as one of civilization's most powerful archetypes. The Swiss psychologist Carl Jung understood such enduring narratives not as simple historical data or arbitrary fictions, but as vivid projections of the collective unconscious. Within this framework, Atlantis represents the universal human memory of an idealized, primordial state of wholeness and perfection, a golden cradle of innocence and absolute potential that every individual and culture subconsciously feels they have tragically lost to the slow, corrupting friction of time and experience. This psychological landscape explains why the hunger for the lost empire remains entirely unquenched by the clinical, scientific mapping of the deep ocean floors. The enduring power of the narrative lies not in its ability to satisfy empirical researchers, but in its capacity to mirror humanity's deepest spiritual anxieties and grandest existential longings. It stands as a majestic, dual-faceted monument within our collective imagination, simultaneously symbolizing the absolute heights of human creative genius, technological mastery, and societal harmony, while serving as the ultimate, chilling reminder of our fundamental fragility before the blind, colossal forces of nature and the immutable laws of moral cause and effect. As our long chronological voyage across the vast ocean of time finally reaches its quiet conclusion, the shifting rings of the ancient capital, the fiery warnings of the classical philosophers, and the deep, mysterious waters of the past begin to soften and dissolve. The long lines of old manuscripts, the intense academic debates of the centuries, and the grand, sweeping timelines of human prehistory recede into a gentle, distant horizon, leaving you completely anchored in the safety and stillness of the present moment. The entire world, from its ancient cataclysms to its modern complexities, rests in absolute, quiet harmony beneath the infinite, starlit canopy of the night. Let your mind completely surrender its remaining thoughts to the deep, comforting stability of the darkness around you. There are no more maps to chart, no more lineages to trace, and no more historical puzzles left to solve. The regular, peaceful rhythm of your breathing matches the timeless, slow movement of the deep oceans, filling your consciousness with a profound sense of warmth, safety, and ultimate peace. Wrapped securely within the quiet sanctuary of the night, allow the steady, soothing tide of time to gently wash over your mind, carrying you softly down into a deep, heavy, and beautifully undisturbed sleep.